Now, those of you who have followed some of the stuff that I've been putting out over the last decade or so will know that one of the trigger moments in forcing me to question my worldview was my visit to Kuwait in late March of 1991 as one of the first civilians to go into Kuwait after the end of hostilities in the first Gulf War. And what I discovered there, that it wasn't the Iraqi troops that set the 630-odd wells alight, it was the US Special Forces. And it took until 2003 for me to get absolute corroboration of that, which came from a member of the US Special Forces who stated that he had been part of the teams that were set in there to set the wells alight. The purpose, of course, being to demonize Saddam Hussein in the eyes of the world, to put the sanctions on Iraq and keep Iraqi oil off of the global market. And believe it or not, back in 1991, that was a real shock. That was a real shock. And it really did take quite a while for it to sink in, for the magnitude of what occurred to sink in. And those of you who saw my presentation from, I think it was 2006, will know that at the time, basically, it was made abundantly clear that if I shared what I thought I'd seen, then it might not just be career limiting, it could be life limiting. And of course, a mental block. Tariq Aziz, the Iraqi foreign minister at the time, who was unique in Iraqi politics because he was a Christian, but very, very well regarded, very highly regarded in the international diplomatic community. And although being a diplomat, he would never, of course, come out and state openly that they didn't set the wells alight. But he, on a number of occasions, made the observation, he said, what benefit would we have got from setting the wells alight? Which, to the critical thinker, should have actually sown the seeds. But, we're fed a script by the media of what it is that we're supposed to believe. And even though we have access to what we believe to be independent media, alternative media today, it is still difficult to actually get to the root of the truth. So for our next speaker, the role that they play in helping people to get a different picture other than that which the establishment is trying to create to get their social license to be able to continue their genocidal agenda. And it's not one-dimensional by any stretch of the imagination. And you'll see as the weekend goes on, what's occurring in the Middle East actually goes much deeper than just in terms of the impact on the Middle East. So for our next speaker, Vanessa Beeley, she has been doing some truly outstanding work, some research, and trying to share with a wider audience her insights into what is really going on, and particularly some of the organizations which are painted as humanitarian, but perhaps have a somewhat different agenda. And Vanessa has been working very closely with Patrick Henningsen and also with the UK column. And I see that Mike Robinson has his white helmet here. But it is my great pleasure to welcome for the first time to an AV event, Vanessa Beeley and her talk, NGOs, Humanitarians or Executioners.
I kind of feel a bit lost up here because I haven't got Pat and Mike asking me the questions. I've kind of got to do it all on my own. So forgive me if I kind of stumble a little bit without their help, which has always been enormously helpful as a platform to get out the information that is being hugely ignored, particularly by the mainstream media in the West, and is causing, I can't underestimate the damage that it is actually doing to the people of these countries that are being intervened in and that are having illegal wars of aggression waged against them. These are not the conflicts that are portrayed to you. They're not civil wars. They're not sectarian wars. They're not even religious wars in any way, shape, or form. They are lawless wars that are being waged against sovereign nations. What I'm going to look at today is the very important role that the NGOs play in this intervention process. And the slide might be a little bit shocking for some people, humanitarians or executioners. Do I mean executioners in a literal way? Yes, fundamentally, in particularly in Syria. But also executioners, as I hope that I'm going to display, of an imperialist agenda inside sovereign nations. This is a quote from an Ottawa American Indian chief. They came with a Bible and their religion. They stole our land and crushed our spirit. And now they tell us we should be thankful to the Lord for being saved. Now, this was the missionary complex, if you like, that was the pre-runner or the forerunner to the NGO complex, or certainly that's how I see it. Sorry, I do slightly need my notes every now and then. What comprises the global south is perceived by the global north, and that incorporates the Middle East, is perceived by the global north to be uncivilized, dishonest, corrupt, in need of our education or re-education to basically model them in our image, as if their image is simply not good enough. We look to impose upon them all the qualities that we perceive that are imbued in Western society. Civilization, development, we're not primitive, which is how we perceive them to be. And these post-colonial human beings are depicted as the unenlightened others in need of that remodeling process. For me, the NGO process, or soft power complex, is now one of the most destructive global forces. It's employed as an interface between hegemonic nations like the United States, like the NATO nations, to infiltrate, target, or I actually call them prey nations, nations that have been targeted for geopolitical intervention, or even, the problem is that with the onset of social media particular, or an alternative media, it's becoming harder for them to directly invade militarily as they did in Iraq. People are kind of, they're clued into it now. So they have to find another method. And the way that I look at it, I've put this up, the Trojan horse. The NGOs remind me of two things. They remind me, yes, of the Trojan horse, but they also kind of remind me of the protection guys in the mafia. In other words, they're sent out there to sell protection on behalf of the mafia. The mafia, for me, is the state and the military-industrial complex, particularly, but also the deep state, the CIA or the British intelligence services. They're kind of the nice guys that offer protection if you just buy into capitalist and imperialist principles. They're kind of the good cop in the bad cop, good cop routine. They're the ones that kind of persuade you in a nice way to do exactly what the bad cop wants you to do. Who are the bad cops? As I said, the deep state, military, intelligence, and then their creations, terrorism. Terrorism is the flip side of the NGO. But for me, they're both connected back to the same root. So they're both being used, as I say, in the good cop, bad cop routine in order to achieve imperialist gains. Starvation and economic hardships. We can't deny that these are also concepts of imperialism and that they're often imposed upon target nations prior to intervention, prior to sending the NGOs in, and then prior to sending the military in. Starvation can be manufactured. We've seen this in Syria. I'll come on to that a little bit later. NGOs also act as scouts, spies. They're sent out there, and hence the Trojan horse, they're sent out there under the guise of humanitarianism in order to act as scouts for the territory, to glean information from the cultures and societies that they've gone into. They also co-opt people from inside those societies and those cultures to feed back information to them. And the way they can do that is that they will often go into relatively poverty-stricken areas in these countries, and they offer very good salaries. It's easy. It's just a financial honeycoating for the spying process. One thing we have to be very sure of: capitalism is not going to create something which will ultimately bring about its demise. NGOs, non-government funded organizations, are almost never non-government funded organizations. And as such, they will be either overtly hostile or they will co-opt true grassroots movements. This is actually graffiti, which I think Pat might appreciate, from Egypt. I think, for me, it's very powerful because it's actually depicting one of the many Arab Springs that took place in Egypt. But all of them have been hijacked and stifled and stultified particularly by the NGO complex in Egypt. And what we also have to ask is, if all the bad guys are triggered by our governments and the NGOs are funded by the same governments, doesn't the symbiosis become very clear? We're all familiar with how they market war these days. War is peace. War is going to bring us resolution to any problem or situation in a sovereign nation that they are portraying or conveying to us. How do they persuade us that war is good? They instill or trigger a sense of fear or of righteousness. This is how they instill in us the desire to do something, to put something right. One is, of course, the war on terror. They create this fear in us that there's some kind of hordes of axe-wielding, massacring extremists that are heading for our shores, despite the fact that the majority of insane killings in America have been carried out by white right-wing atheists, but they don't call for them to be expelled from the United States. Righteousness is a little bit more complicated. What they do is trigger in us an innate crusader complex that we do kind of all have, particularly in the global north. We can't deny our colonialist heritage. And that subliminally is, or even unconsciously, is dormant within us until they trigger us. And I'm not saying it's a negative aspect of us, but I'm saying it can be harnessed in a negative way, and it can be used to rationalize the need to go to war in one of these countries to save the people from a tyrannical regime. Is a very familiar call that we hear all the time. And what I want to try and do today is to not argue whether a government or a political party is good or not, but to argue that we must question, one, and two, that above all we respect the will of the people of that nation. What do we do with that fear of terror, or the feeling of helplessness that we can't do anything about that kind of righteous feeling that we have, or the desire to save, the desire to help, the desire to make people's lives better? We feel helpless. We're already swamped. We're swamped financially. We feel insecure in our job. We have financial problems. We start kind of flailing around going, I don't know what I can do. I don't know what I can do to make it better. Well, guess what? Here's a bottle of NGO medicine. And almost immediately, all that feeling of helplessness is resolved. It's sort of taken away because there's this feeling like, great, I can just hand over the guilt that I'm feeling for the suffering of these people to an organization that's non-government funded and that is going to really do what's best for those people. So I can kind of give some money or give a bit of time or go and help the refugees, and that makes me feel better. I can then sort of forget about the root causes because I've dealt with the symptoms. That's not a judgment on anybody because we've all been there. And so I'm not judging anyone in this at all, but I'm just saying they are so clever at manipulating. They are so clever. And I also want to sort of say I'm not judging anybody that works for an NGO either, because most people go into an NGO with the best of intentions. What they're probably not understanding is the structure of those NGOs. Any of you seen the film Gaslight? It was made in about 1940, I think, the first one. Gaslighting is now, it's a psychological phenomenon. It's whereby an abuser will alter, or through manipulation and through mind games, perception-altering mind games, they will reduce somebody's ability or erode it completely to form judgment and to maintain their own self-identity. And then eventually what they will do is to replace that person's reality with their version of reality. And by the time that they reach this point, the victim is basically so overwhelmed and so in need of reality to hold on to that they cling on to whatever reality is given them. That's what the media and the state apparatus do to us. And they are aided and abetted in a huge way by the NGO complex. What is the NPIC? Excuse me. The not-for-profit industrial complex. Now, I'm going to show very, very simply here, and I've taken elite off that. You'll be glad to know. At the top of the triangle, you have the state, or the government. That interacts with the ruling leeches or parasites, who in turn will create foundations, like the Ford Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. These in turn will create NGOs. Guess what? You've got a closed loop money laundering system, right? The foundations that are supposedly not-for-profit, philanthropic, create an NGO. You give money to the NGO, it goes back to the foundations give it back to the ruling classes give it back to the government, and round it goes. Okay? It's also a bringing together in the matrix of the deep state, the intelligence agencies, with the NGOs, with the foundations, with the ruling classes, and with the state. So what does it actually mean? It's a profitable graveyard for social movements. What does the NPIC do? Well, as I've explained, it allows state corporations to disguise neocolonialism, exploitation, and even militarism as philanthropy or humanitarianism. It redirects activist energies into career-based modes of change promotion. Change. I'm going to be talking about this word in a minute. Change, climate change. I mean, change is a word. As soon as you hear it, the alarm bell should go off. Regime change. Okay? Instead of mass-based organizing capable of pragmatic, realistic transformation. It's a much healthier word for me. As I've mentioned, it diverts public monies into private hands through the foundations. It monitors and co-ops social justice movements and local activism. I've taken this quote from an American think tank paper where actually they're being incredibly blatant about what they use NGOs to do. In some countries, local NGOs also have been funded to mount people power campaigns. As in recent colour revolutions, these campaigns are aimed at opening up political regimes to opposition parties. Now, read opposition parties, read what suits the West. Okay, it's not a genuine opposition party. And ousting leaders considered undesirable. So they've been pretty blatant about it there. This is the important one. That's actually an Amnesty International image, but I've kind of pinched it. They manage and declaw dissent in order to safeguard capitalism. I've lived in Palestine for extensive periods, and I've seen this absolutely firsthand. After the Oslo Agreement was made in 1993, the NGO complex grew exponentially in Palestine. Why? Because they wanted to stifle and basically stultify, get rid of any opposition to the Oslo Agreement. So from 1992 to 2005, the number of NGOs in Palestine, which if you imagine the size of it, it's tiny. Gaza itself is about the size of the Isle of Wight. There were 400 NGOs in about 1995. By 2005, so 10 years later, we were up at 1,400. By 2016, I can almost guarantee there will be over 2,000. Now, these NGOs in Palestine act as a complete damper on the resistance movement. It's been co-opted. These NGOs are entirely funded by the West. So by NATO, by the US, who we know work in lockstep with the illegal state of Israel, the Zionist regime that is occupying and brutalizing the Palestinians. They also control healthcare, education, as I said, the resistance movements. Because of the financial crisis in Palestine, a lot of the resistance movements were actually forced to become NGOs to then be able to go to the West and ask for money. So can you see how then that entire resistance movement is being mollified? It's being brought into line. It's being controlled. It's being softened. It's being made basically unable to do anything about the Israeli occupation. I'd actually like to give an example of that. When I was in Gaza, I was very honored to attend a meeting with the Small Enterprise Commission. And there were about 20 young entrepreneurs from Gaza, all of whom had these unbelievable ideas for small businesses, initiatives. These people are living under intense brutality and oppression and deprivation, especially now since the war in 2014. But they still had the ability to want to self-determine, to want to manage their own lives and to create something that would generate a good effect for their own people, but also bring some sort of monetary reward for them. There was a young guy there. He had developed a product that would help the disabled people from all the various wars in Gaza to become more self-sufficient. And he had basically gone to various NGOs based in Gaza, and he told them about this idea that would basically improve people's lives exponentially. Do you know what those NGOs said? They said, we can't do this, because if we do this, we lose the funding for this. Right? That was heartbreaking. That was like a sort of, I didn't have anything to say. Because this guy then gave this product to the disabled people of Gaza so that they would be okay. He's bankrupt, he has no business, and he has no ability to make money. He had kids, he had a family to look after. This is what NGOs do. They also encourage social movements to model themselves after capitalist structures rather than to challenge them. Why do we buy into NGOs? Why do we need them? I think fundamentally there's two things. I do a lot of work. If you want to check up on the NGO complex, a site called The Wrong Kind of Green, which is run by Corey Morningstar, who's probably one of the biggest experts out there now on the entire complex. We want to believe in a power for good. We want, in some ways, to be able to hand the responsibility for change over to somebody else. You know, as I said, we're busy, we're swamped, we're overwhelmed. And it's kind of nice to think there is a power for good that we can kind of go, please do something about it. Unfortunately, as I'm discussing with Corey, and I'm certainly not including people in this room, but there is an element of apathy. People kind of don't want to have to think about people that are in far-flung lands. They don't want to have to take responsibility for that, despite the fact that it's our own governments that are causing their misery. And I was kind of searching the web I thought, I wonder if there's any apps for charity giving. Yeah, guess what? Nowadays, if you take a selfie, you have an app that will send £1 or whatever you decide to the charity or the NGO of your choice. There's another app, whereas if you're driving past an NGO, it'll beep at you so you can quickly donate. So I'm saying, like, we're being driven down this tunnel towards, it's basically rewarding us for our apathy. It's basically saying, hey, it's okay, we'll make it even easier for you to not even think about what's going on over there. Clicktivism. I'm sorry, bit of a play there, apathy. But this was actually taken from one of the apps. This app reminds you that the money could be put to better use. It's like the politically correct, actionable version of your mom telling you to clean your plate for the sake of the starving kids. I mean, seriously? How do they do it? Not extrasensory perception. They encourage empathy. They solicit sympathy. And I had to find a P word. They persuade perception, so persuasion. And how do they do this? Heart-tugging images. I've deliberately used ones, in particular from Syria, because that's what I'm going to focus on in the second part of the presentation. But here you have a very sort of evocative image. President Obama, what are you waiting for? So fundamentally, an NGO is calling for war. War is peace, right? What they're actually asking for is a no-fly zone on the back of the now proven false flag of the Ghouta chemical attacks in 2013. The no-fly zone is what they're trying to achieve in Syria. Why? We only have to look at Libya, which is now a completely failed state after the no-fly zone allowed the NATO and US planes in to bomb it into oblivion. Another one from Syria, again, based on the completely discredited chemical attacks that were supposedly carried out by the Syrian Arab Army. One of the early white helmet images. Don't you all want to reach out and save the baby? This was a conference given by Human Rights Watch, one of the not only government-funded NGOs, but Saudi, Riyadh-funded NGOs, the only absolute monarchy in the world, with an execution process, and one of the most corrupt regimes in the world is funding this NGO. This is how change happens. They've actually put it very simply. They write about something, they film it, and then they debate it in order to achieve change. Now, I've been to one of these think tank debates up in St Andrews in Scotland, run by the Asfari Foundation. It was on Syria. There was not one Syrian from Syria there. So how can it be sort of, an objective debate that is working towards resolution in a country when they do not include the voices of the people from that country. I was talking about change. Change is the buzzword. It's the word that they come out with every time to make us buy into what they want us to do. This is actually taken from an Amnesty International poster on Libya. Do you remember the lies about Gaddafi's troops on drugs raping the civilians in Benghazi? A lie. But this was produced, again, to bring us to the failed state status of Libya. It incurred the no-fly zone. To change everything, we need everyone. Well, yeah, that's right. And that's why we can never underestimate the sheer power of the apparatus that is being built up in order to force us down the change route that they want us to go. I also found last night when I was kind of looking around, it was a lecture given to NGOs by the Forum for the Future, which was run by an ex-British government MP. And it actually, the title was, How Can We Be More Effective Change Agents? The 3 Ps. Power. Power means to go into a target nation and to determine who has the power in that nation, and then, in the opposition, rather, in that nation, and then co-opt them, bring them onto your side, because you're going to need them to influence the people in that country. Psychology. Work out the psychology of that nation. This is where NGOs come in as infiltration agents. They go in, they work out the psychology. How can they best manipulate them? How can they best achieve their objectives in that region? Through soft power. Persistence. Well, this is a great one. Keep going at it, because if you stop, then you're going to give them time to regroup and to think about what's going on and to actually resist you. So persistence is counter-resistance. If we actually look at this is a lecture given to NGOs. Let's look at what happened again in Palestine in 1948. There was a British general, Orde Wingate, who engineered the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in 1948. How did he do it? The military went in and they surveyed every single village in Palestine. They worked out who the person in power was, who was the influential imam, who were the main families in those villages, so that they could be hit first. So what we did militarily in 1948, we're doing again now through soft power. And as I said, what do they sell us? What is change to them? Conformity is unity, and war is peace. Now we come to Syria. Syria is one of the biggest propaganda schemes of our time. When the dust settles, if it does, it will be revealed. Professor Abu Khalil. In Syria, I describe the NGO complex as a hydra. You cut one head off, you expose one head, another one grows back almost as quickly before you can even blink. For me, it's as Professor Tim Anderson says, who spent extensive time in Syria covering events there. It's the dirtiest war in history that is being waged against the Syrian people right now and for the last 5 years. This is it's a tiny percentage, and I've included the intelligence agencies on there because for me, I can't separate them. But this is a tiny percentage of the NGOs that are involved in Syria. What I'm going to do is run through them a little bit, but I'm going to take the 2 main ones. The first one is USAID. The United States Agency for International Development. Great name. Again, as soon as you see development in anything, or democracy, or change, forget it. USAID was set up in 1961 by the US Congress. Basically, it's recognized as a front organization for the CIA to channel and filter funding and strategic political support to groups and individuals that support the US agenda abroad. Under the pretext of promoting democracy, it's awarded grants to pseudo-revolutionary, fascist, extremist right and terrorist groups to aid the Western desired regime change in any sovereign nation. So, as we've demonstrated, US aid and the CIA, the deep state, are interlinked. This is a quote from Daddy Cherry. I can't remember the name of her website. I think it's Junkie Post. But she's worth reading. She's from Haiti. And she writes some of the most passionate articles I've ever read on basically the intervention in Haiti. She describes Haiti in one of her articles as a completely self-sustaining culture. She describes it with such love and affection for this sort of slightly crazy, but ecologically sound, perfectly happy, zero poverty, self-sustaining culture prior to the US aid intervention, which was propelled, I think, it was by Clinton. And as she said, Haiti's a laboratory. US aid, the World Bank, and the UN. The UN, by the way, is probably the ultimate NGO, the diseased NGO. These are some of the countries. I just picked out some logos that they'd all created. So a lot of South American countries were hit hard. Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia. Chavez actually threw them out. And recently, Syria, Yemen, and Palestine. What I'd also like to share with you is something that happened when I was at the UN Human Rights Council in March. I was representing Yemen, testifying against Saudi Arabia for their illegal use of US-supplied cluster munitions that were being used to target exclusively civilian areas. Over 56 usages of cluster munitions in Yemen. But the interesting thing that I picked up on while I was there, the King Salman Center, which is the biggest oxymoron on the planet, which is a Saudi Arabian NGO, humanitarian NGO, was presenting its case at the UN. What horrified me, though maybe it shouldn't have done, was those that were celebrating with them and enjoying the collaboration with them were UNICEF, OCHA, and the UN itself, and US aid. Then I started digging a little bit more. Saudi Arabia started its war of aggression on Yemen in March 2015. In June 2015, US aid that has the monopoly on the aid agencies in Yemen turned the tap off. So the UN, under Resolution 2216, which puts an embargo on 5 named individuals, but is being used by Saudi Arabia to collectively punish 27 million Yemenis with a land, air, and sea blockade. Humanitarian aid and food is not getting into Yemen. On top of that, US aid turned off the aid because it was too difficult to get it in through the conflict. 3 weeks later, King Salman Center set up, and the US aid endorsed it. So again, we're seeing this closed loop. Saudi Arabia can go in and decimate a country, and it can be then given the endorsement by US aid to go in and reap the benefits by rebuilding it. These are 2 of the kids that are suffering the results of this policy in Yemen. These kids were in Bani Qais, and they're starving. Bani Qais is in the north of Yemen. The second protagonist, the second pivotal funder of the NGOs in Syria is none other than George Soros, convicted criminal insider trader and hedge fund billionaire, as I'm sure you all know. Syria is, in fact, the billionaire's revolution. Again, this is an infographic prepared by Professor Tim Anderson. And you'll see that Soros is down there with his Open Society Foundation, putting in 20 billion into the regime change process in Syria. And he's joined by Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Zionists. I call him the war porn wizard in Syria. These are just a few of the NGOs that he juggles in order to produce the propaganda that is calling for regime change in Syria. Just a few of them. And what I'll do here is I'm going to put them up on the screen because I was so shocked when I actually went through and found out how many there are. Some of you might recognize them, some of you might not, but these are all US aid or Soros-backed campaigns or NGOs. Aleppo is burning. I just want to touch on this one very quickly because it's current. This one has just precipitated the massacre of 60 Syrians in Al-Zara in the Hama district in Syria. Women and children were massacred yesterday here. Now, the reason that happened was because Rami Jarrah of Anna Press, that's going to come up on here, is a Soros-funded organization. Soros is behind the creation of Aleppo is Burning. If anybody wants to talk to me about the intricacies of the Aleppo situation, great, come and talk to me afterwards. But all I can tell you is that what you are receiving via the propaganda channels is so far removed from the truth, it is untrue. And while everybody believes this campaign, there are people dying. And they are being massacred. They're not simply dying, they're being massacred by the terrorists on the ground that are being protected by campaigns like this. It's kind of impressive, right? All of these are funded by Soros and USAID. Now, the reason I've put the BBC up there is because you may have noticed that the BBC's been co-opted into the Open Democracy website, which is now monitoring and directing it and giving it ideas on how it might improve its process, which includes using the citizen journalists in Syria. Open Democracy is run by Soros. MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, funded by George Soros. MSF have no hospitals in Syria. None. Okay? They have what they call supported MSF hospitals. MSF have admitted this, by the way, officially. They have no hospitals in Syria. They are illegally in Syria. And the hospitals that are termed MSF hospitals are only and exclusively in terrorist-held areas. That's a fact, okay? The one guy that escapes Soros funding, but he's EU funded, is the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. So although he does escape being painted with the Soros brush, here we see him leaving the Foreign and Commonwealth Office after meeting Britain's Foreign Secretary William Hague in 2011. So yeah, okay, he's free from Soros, but he's well entangled with the EU. You all know who Avars are. You've all come across them. You've all seen their petitions. Don't sign any more of them. Avars. Yeah, you all know them through their petitions, particularly on social media, but they're a very powerful entity. I believe on the last count they have over 30 million followers. Behavioral change agents, okay? The petitions are out there to gauge public response, but also to garner public response. If we look at how they were created, It was born out of a fairly unholy alliance of the Democratic Party, MoveOn.org, which was the organization set up to kind of move everyone on after President Clinton's sexual misdemeanors. So it was basically set up through MoveOn.org and George Soros. Res Publica and another organization were involved, but those are the two main ones. So if you look at the founders of Avaaz, you have Tom Perriello, Rikin Patel, Jeremy Hymans, and David Madden, and James Slezak. Now, all of these sort of pretty much combined together to go on and form or found a company called Purpose. Purpose is a Manhattan-based advertising agency, PR agency, which specializes in behavioral change, changing the paradigm, changing public consensus. That's its entire raison d'etre, let's say. Purpose then went on to create the first 4 of the NGOs that are heavily involved in Syria. The Syria Campaign, White Helmets, Free Syrian Voices, and With Syria. So fundamentally, once again, you have those who are behind Avaaz, Ivy League, Harvard, Yale, golden boys of the imperialist nations, or certainly of the US. And again, Soros funding into Avaaz, and then partnership with Purpose, which is then creating those 4 NGOs. Here is Tom Perriello getting pretty close with Obama. Now, Avaaz is an interesting one, because Avaaz is an interlocking and interchanging cog in that wheel of fifth columnists. It can either instigate or it can take the results and then convert them into public consensus. So I'm going to look at it from both ends so that you can get a comprehension of what they do. In 2012, at that time, I think they had an annual budget of around 17 million, although that's probably conservative. In 2012, Avaaz set up their Smuggle Hope into Syria, I don't know if anybody remembers that, petition to raise, and they managed to raise over $1.2 million of public money. And the campaign was run by Syrian Danny Abdel Dayem. And I don't know if you all remember, but he was the one that was basically exposed producing fake bombing, shelling reports for CNN. He was fundamentally in a studio making it all up, and he was exposed. So he was used as the poor revolutionary on the ground in Homs, desperately in need of public aid and help to smuggle the equipment into Syria to foment that legitimate revolution. So through him, 1.2 million of public money was raised and sent into Syria. And with that money, they set up what we would call an agitprop shop. So they had chosen journalists, citizen journalists, who were the core or the nucleus of that revolution. And through them, they fanned it out into people that they handpicked to give this equipment to, cameras, mobile phones, to produce the reports that were then fed back to the BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, other propaganda megaphones, who then produced this narrative of this grassroots revolution that was happening in Syria. So you had the citizen journalist Danny Abdel Dayem and Rami Jarrah. Rami Jarrah at that point was known as Alexander Page. What they were also responsible for was smuggling Western media into Syria to report from rebel-held areas only, because they entered Syria illegally through this smuggling system. You might all remember the death of Murray Colvin, the Sunday Times reporter in Homs. That was one of the reporters that they smuggled in. And at the time, it almost precipitated, again, another no-fly zone. But the Syrian government quite rightly said, well, if you enter our country illegally, we are not responsible for your safety, which is logical. So ultimately, the goal is regime change via propaganda. Then let's look at it the other way. So you have nations that have a vested interest in regime change in Syria. They create Purpose, a PR marketing company. They then incubate the Syria campaign, who then launches the brand, the White Helmets, first responders, humanitarians, search and rescue teams on the ground in Syria. The White Helmets are heavily promoted by the Western media. In this case, we've taken Nicholas Kristof at the New York Times. The White Helmets on the ground in Syria, first responders, search and rescue, start saying, we must have a no-fly zone because we're being targeted by the barrel bomb. Avaz raises the petition calling for a no-fly zone. I'm just showing you two methods of how this propaganda trail works and how the NGOs are an integral part of that machine. Now I'm going to get on to my favorite subject, the White Helmets. First of all, I'm going to look at what their propaganda says about them. They're bakers, they're tailors, they're engineers, they're pharmacists, they're painters, they're carpenters, they're students, they're ordinary people. And they exist only for humanity, solidarity, and impartiality. This is all taken from their website. I'm not making any of this up. When I want to save someone's life, I don't care if he's an enemy or a friend. What concerns me is the soul that might die. They're invested in life. Are you noticing the ESP, the images? Give to Syria's heroes who give hope to life. I don't know who's writing all this. The White Helmets mostly deal with the aftermath of government air attacks, yet they have risked sniper fire to rescue bodies of government soldiers to give them proper burial. They're unarmed and neutral. They're from the people, for the people. They employ women, so there's no gender differentiation in the White Helmets. They even employ children with Halloween posters. I never quite got that one, but... and the fluff factor, kittens, cats. You will see them photographed everywhere, feeding the cats, saving the cats, holding the cats. They're under attack for saving lives. Are they affiliated with any side in the Syrian conflict? Taken directly from their website. We're not tied to any political group in Syria or anywhere else. We criticize anyone violating human rights, no matter what side they're on. How are they funded? This is important. The Syria campaign is fiercely independent. The Syria campaign has produced the White Helmets and accepts no money from governments, corporations, or anyone directly involved in the Syrian conflict. And they're nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. I actually showed this presentation to a friend of mine that knew nothing about the White Helmets, and after that little section, she went, well, I'd give them the Nobel Peace Prize after that lot. They're a very British affair. US aid has given $23 million to the White Helmets. Our own UK Foreign Office has given £19 million, admitted in the Daily Telegraph after one of our articles was published. They also mitigated a few of our other claims, so I think that was sort of damage limitation. So they're government funded. They're US and UK government funded, who have a vested interest in the conflict in Syria. They were set up by humanitarian James Bond, James Le Mesurier. James Le Mesurier has a very interesting background. British military, mercenary now, one of the most highly commended officers in Sandhurst. He had a very interesting career, having left the British Army in 2000. He then worked with the UN at virtually all of their intervention nations. So Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, the list goes on. In 2014, he also set up a splinter group from the White Helmets, Mayday Rescue, which is also UK government funded. James Le Mesurier also worked up until 2008 for a group called Olive Group. Olive Group in 2015 merged with a group called Constellus. Constellus have in their portfolio a company called Academy, which is Blackwater. So you might recognize who that is. Basically, Olive Group, during the Iraq War, the second one, they were awarded a multi-million contract in conjunction with Bechtel in Iraq by US aid. But the merger also into Constellus and into Academy that is Blackwater, Bush was responsible for creating the situation where the CIA could outsource their assassinations to Blackwater. But it didn't stop with Bush. Obama gave $250 million to Blackwater to continue unspecified services to the CIA. So to continue carrying out assassinations without any accountability for the American government. So that goes straight back to the CIA. In 2008, James Le Mesurier joined Good Harbor. Both these companies are based in Dubai. He joined Good Harbor. Good Harbor, the CEO of Good Harbor is a guy called Richard A. Clarke. He was the terror advisor for Bush. He was purported to be a whistleblower, but now the consensus will say that basically he was a gatekeeper. He prevented Rumsfeld and Bush being prosecuted for their part in 9/11. He basically gave credence to the bin Laden story and the fact, and gave credence to the fact that Al-Qaeda is an organic entity. It's not being created by the United States government. But what's even sort of maybe more interesting is Clarke's connections to Rita Katz, a US-Israeli operative who runs Site Intelligence. Site has been responsible for propagating all of the ISIS and Al-Qaeda execution videos. So we go back to Homeland Security and to Israeli intelligence. Then if we go from Mayday Rescue to one of their leaders, Farouk al-Habib, who's a member of the Syrian National Opposition, the Syrian National Council, which also has deep state connections back to the CIA. Raid Saleh, one of the leaders of the White Helmets, you might have heard about him, which is why the White Helmet's particularly poignant. You might have heard about him in the last 2 weeks. He was due to go to the States to be given an award by Relief International and Interaction, both of which are USAID Soros-backed NGOs. He was deported from Dulles Airport in the States. For a long time, no reason was given for this, until finally the Department of State, a spokesperson, Mark Toner, was put on the spot by Matt Lee of Associated Press. And he finally admitted that the reason that Raid Saleh had been spun was because of his extremist connections. Even though he was questioned and he was asked, he said, well, hang on, you've just deported somebody because they have extremist connections and they are the leader of this group. How come the group is not being associated with those extremist connections? Bear in mind, Bush destroyed 2 countries on the basis of their connections to Al-Qaeda. we also have to consider one of the other seed funders of the Syria campaign in particular is a guy called Ayman Asfari, billionaire CEO of petrol company that maybe you know, Ian, Petrofac. He has vested interests in Syria with both Shell and BP. So we're back to oil. If we look at this, the Syrian government, the current Syrian government, supports the Iran-Iraq pipeline, which is Russian-backed also. The US is in favor of the Qatar-Turkey pipeline. It's also worth noticing where that pipeline cuts through. It's Aleppo. So it gives an indication of why Aleppo is so important to them right now. I think it's Kennedy's nephew that also broke the news a couple of days ago that basically the war in Syria is to secure this pipeline and to prevent Russian influence on the oil revenue in Syria. Okay, now let's get to the white helmets themselves. Again, they're embedded entirely in al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda, and ISIS areas. So they do not operate in Syrian or government-held areas in Syria where the majority of the internally displaced people take refuge. So when they say they are for the people, I have to say that the majority of Syrians don't even know who they are. In the background, you'll see al-Nusra flags, and almost every video that you see of the white helmets, you will see the flags in the background. Remember, the white helmets mostly deal with the aftermath of government air attacks, yet they've risked sniper fire to rescue bodies of government soldiers to give them a proper burial. Well, these are government soldiers. And they've been massacred, they've had their boots removed, they've been thrown on the back of a truck. And they then flick the victory V. But they're impartial. When I want to save someone's life, I don't care if he's an enemy or a friend. What concerns me is that the soul might die. This is the difference between picking up bodies of their own operatives and picking up the bodies of the Syrian Arab Army, the Syrian National Army.
حتى نخرجهم إلى أهلهم نوثق بعض الجثث بحوزتهم هوية أو إثبات أو كذا ونحن الآن شبيحة يبقى إلى آخر من يحمل.
And here, these impartial saviors of humanity, they are holding up banners calling for the burning and the destruction of two Ara al-Sham al-Qaeda besieged villages, Kafraya and Fua. You might have seen some of my articles on them. These villages have been under siege for 5 years, since 2011, partial siege, and since March 2015, full siege. They've lost over 1,700 civilians to shelling and to sniping. They're calling for the burning. They're unarmed and neutral, apart from this white helmet that stood on an Al-Qaeda tank carrying a submachine gun. I'll skip the video just to... Remember this one. We criticize anyone violating human rights, no matter what side they're on. This is a white helmet operative, Muaya Aga Hassan. You can find him on Twitter and you can find him on Facebook. Here he is last week, taking a selfie with two Syrian Arab army soldiers who were tortured publicly and executed publicly with white helmets in attendance. I'm not going to even attempt to show you the video because, one, it's so distressing for the family. They actually asked everyone to take the video down. which you can see from his Facebook page. So they are fiercely independent. They accept no money from governments, except for the fact that they are the British government's people in Syria, who've given them £19 million. If you look at any of their accounts on Twitter or Facebook, they follow almost predominantly ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but they're funded 23 million by the United States government. You will only see them in terrorist-held areas, and yet Holland has just decided to give them 4 million euros. So the white helmets regularly fake evidence and recycle photographs. I haven't included them in here, but if you want to check them out, then talk to me afterwards. They are armed, not unarmed. They are sectarian, not impartial or neutral. They are embedded with ISIS and al-Nusra al-Qaeda. They are funded by US, UK, and EU governments. They're trained in Turkey, the biggest terrorist incubator in this conflict. They're funded by an oil baron and the Syrian opposition. And above all, they are executioners, not humanitarians. On behalf of the Syrian people who know that I'm here today to give this talk, the first responder term has been glorified by 9/11, and it's untouchable in PR terms. And what we're seeing now is an embedded shadow military force through which they can run supplies, weapons, fighters, gather intelligence, and even create medical triage for terrorist fighters, mercenaries, or soldiers, intent upon denying the Syrian people their right to decide their own future. If we lived in a just world, we would see Avaz and their ilk clamoring for an end to interventionism and demanding diplomatic solutions to support internal sovereign nation peace processes, as Russia is actually doing in Syria. However, we don't live in a world based upon a universal understanding of justice. We live in a world governed by the powerful and the greedy, devoid of compassion, intent only on their geopolitical prowess and humanity-exempt colonialism. For the sake of the Syrian people, we have to opt out of this matrix, this apparatus. If we do nothing else, we have to start questioning the overarching narrative that's being put out there by the mainstream media. And I know that all of you guys do that, but we need to encourage other people to do it as well. My opinion is not necessarily the truth, but it's an alternative. And that's what people have to be looking for, because these guys are dying as a result of the actions of these organizations and their creators and those that are benefiting from what they're doing. These people are dying trying to resist it. So the least that we can do is to make sure that whatever else we do, we opt out of this system and we try to help other people to do the same. It is possible to open source helping these people. It's really possible to do it. We have the media networks to do it now. We have social media. It's possible. We have to start finding different ways to help them. They deserve it. Because effectively, all they are asking for is the basic human right to determine their own future. And they deserve it. Thank you.
Vanessa Beeley, and increasingly it is independent and alternative media, other than Russia Today, that is providing the truth. I mean, who would have ever believed 30 years ago that we'd be tuning to Russian TV stations to get the truth, huh? Well, here we are, and the roles that the likes of Vanessa and UK Column and 21st Century Wire and all of the other independent outlets play are increasingly important, and the establishment knows it. the establishment right now is putting enormous effort into trying to quell the rising awareness, thanks to the work of the likes of Vanessa, Patrick Henningsen, that ISIS is the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. You know, I did a Humanity versus Insanity a few weeks ago and showed the irrefutable evidence, the admission of Israel of its support for ISIS. And as we're going to see as we unfold through the weekend, you know, what Vanessa has described as going on in Syria is part of a much deeper ethnic cleansing agenda. Nothing is one-dimensional. And what's becoming increasingly important is that we help more and more people see the pieces of the jigsaw for themselves and come to their own realization of what's occurring. So Vanessa, thank you so much. You've added to my education enormously over the last few months. Thank you.